The goal of this video is to give you a quick, high-level overview of Texas's new public school accountability system. So we've made a shift from the 4-index system to the 3-domain system, and there's been a little bit of confusion about what exactly is calculated in each domain, and then what types of strategy do you need in order to impact each of those domains. So the goal here is to take a 171-page accountability manual that has 9 appendices and condense it all down into one piece of paper in 4 quadrants. So obviously there are some things we won't be able to get to in detail, but this will at least give you a starting place for understanding how the accountability system works. So this is our 3-domain accountability system, but you actually see there's 4 quadrants here because one of those domains has 2 parts. I'm going to give you an overview of what each domain is, and then we'll go more into detail with each one. So starting with domain 1, this is what is called the student achievement domain. So domain 2, both of these together, is called the school progress domain, but it's split into 2 different parts. So domain 2 part A is the academic growth domain. And then domain 2 part B is the relative performance domain. Then domain 3 is federal accountability. So this is closing the gaps with all of the subgroups that are on your campus. So we have domain 1, student achievement, domain 2 part A, academic growth, domain 2 part B, which is relative performance, and then domain 3, which is closing the gaps. So one thing to keep in mind, what the state of Texas is going to do is out of these first 3 right here, they're going to take your best score for your campus, and that's going to be weighted at 70% of your accountability. Then they're going to take the score from domain 3, the federal domain, and that's going to be 30% of your score. So it's the best of here at 70%, and then it's 30% is made up of your federal accountability score. All right, so let's start with domain 1, which is student achievement. So if you are an elementary, an intermediate, or a middle school, elementary, intermediate, or middle school, your student achievement domain is made up entirely of your STAR scores. So the way that it works is the state looks at every test administered on your campus. So let's say that you are an elementary school that has 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade tests. So they're going to take 3rd grade reading, 3rd grade math, 4th grade reading, 4th grade math, 4th grade writing, 5th grade math, 5th grade reading, and 5th grade science. And what they're doing is they're looking at the number of students you have at approaches grade level, the number of students at meets grade level, and the number of students you have at master's grade level. So this is a significant change from the past where you only had to get students just above that approaches line. So they take all of your tests together, and here's approaches, here's meets, and here's masters. And they say, okay, so you had a total of 80% of your students approaching the grade level standard in all tests combined. And then maybe you have, let's call it 31% of your students hit meets. And then you had 16% of your students hit masters. Now something to remember here, if a student is in meets, they were also at approaches. So they're counting twice. If a student is at masters, they already passed approaches and meets, so they're counting in each of these categories. So let's go ahead and add this. So this would be 111%, and then plus this, 127. And then they're going to divide that by 3 to get the average. So 3 because you have 3 categories here. Then that's going to give you a raw score. So this is the raw score for domain 1 of 42. Now what the state does with this is they take that raw score, they put it through a scaling formula, and they scale it up to a scale from 0 to 100. There's an online scaling tool if you're interested in exploring that a little bit more. So just for reference here, this 42 raw becomes a 71 scaled. So your scaled component score for domain 1 here is a 71. Now you'll notice that I've said this is elementary, intermediate, and middle schools. For high schools and districts and K-12s, it's a little bit different. This component includes STAR, just like before, but only at 40% of this domain. It includes the CCMR indicator, which is college, career, and military readiness, which makes up 40%. And it includes graduation rate, weighted at 20%. So I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but just know STAR is calculated the same way as it was up here. The approaches, meets, and masters percentages for every test administered on your campus. CCMR is determined by the number of students who have met TSI in math and reading, students who have made a 3 on an AP exam, a 4 on an IB exam, who have declared that they're ready for the military, and then there's some other CTE indicators in there as well. And then you have your graduation rate right here. So all of these things come together. Again, you get a raw score, and then that is scaled up. And again, the accountability manual has all the details on those, but the important part here is elementary, intermediate, and middle, STAR only. High school, K-12s, and districts, combination of STAR, college, career, military readiness, and your graduation rate. So now let's move over here to domain 2, part A, which is academic growth. So with academic growth, the state of Texas is looking at where a student was in the previous year and where they are now in the next year. So let's use 3rd and 4th grade math as an example. So this is 3rd grade math, and this is 4th grade math. And you have your below, so these are the students who didn't meet the passing standard. You have approaches, you have your meets group, and you have your masters group. So you're going to have students in each of these groups for 3rd grade math. Then in 4th grade, these cut points can change from grade to grade. So it's not going to be exactly the same. This cut point might be a little bit higher. So students might have to get a higher score in order to get to approaches. So here's the approaches group. The meets cut point might be a little higher. And then here is the master's cut point at the top. For any test that has a growth measure, so for example, 4th grade math, we're looking at growth from their 3rd grade here. Every student can either earn you 0 points, half a point, or 1 point, depending on how much they grow. So again, this is in the accountability manual, and this is on page 23 if you're interested in seeing all the ways to earn a point for a student. But let's take an example here. Let's say that a student goes from approaches in 3rd grade, and then they make progress, and they jump up, and they make it to meets grade level in 4th grade. So this student has just earned you 1 point, the maximum number of points possible for growth. So let's say now that you have a student who went from meets to masters. That student has also earned you 1 point. So another 1 point kid. And then if you have a student who goes from masters and stays at masters, it's also a 1 point kid. So remember, there are a lot of ways to earn points for a student. I'm not going to go through them all here, but you get the idea. Make progress, right? So you can also have a student who goes from meets and stays at meets, and they don't meet or exceed their growth standard, so they can be a half point student. They can also go from meets to meets, but meet or exceed their growth measure and earn you a point. And then you have students who say we're at approaches and drop to below. That student earns you 0 points. But one of the interesting things about this system, you can have a student who is at below or did not meet grade level, but even if they don't get to approaches, but they meet or exceed their growth measure, they can still earn you a point. So even students who are not hitting the passing standard of approaches can still earn you points in this academic growth domain, which is very important. And this is a shift because now we're thinking about how do we grow every student regardless of where they are on this scale the previous year. So then what the state does is they take as the denominator, let's say you administer 200 tests on your campus that have a growth measure. They take the number of points that you have here, so let's just call that 150, and then that's going to give you the raw score for Domain 2 Part A. So in this case, that's a 75 for the raw. They're going to scale that up. I don't have my scaling tool in front of me, but let's just project. This is a pretty good Domain 2 Part A raw score, so let's just say this goes from 75 to, say, a 92 for the scale. So right now, you have a 71 scale score for Domain 1 and a 92 scale score for Domain 2 Part A. And that's going to be very significant later on when we go to calculate the final calculations. Okay, so we have Domain 1, which was student achievement, approaches, meets, and masters, that averaged. We have Domain 2 Part A, which is academic growth, which is where students are the previous year. How much growth have they made? Have they met or exceeded their growth expectation? Determines whether they're getting 0, half, or 1 point. And now let's move down to Domain 2 Part B. So with relative performance, what the state is doing is they're comparing your Domain 1 score to other campuses that look like you when it comes to your economically disadvantaged percentage. So when I think of Domain 2 Part B, I just think of a graph. And so down here on the x-axis, the state is plotting your economically disadvantaged percentage, all the way from 0% to 100%. So if you're here, you have 0% of your population is economically disadvantaged. If you're over here, 100% of your population is economically disadvantaged. And then, again, for elementary, intermediate, and middles, on the y-axis, they're plotting your Domain 1 score. So that would be all the way from a 0 all the way up to a 100. This is that scale score right there. So in plotting these scores, the state makes the connection that typically the lower your number of economically disadvantaged students, the higher that Domain 1 score is going to be. And as you move this way to the right, then this Domain 1 number tends to drop. So every one of these dots is going to be a school. So I have some schools up here, and then I'm shifting this way, and getting to down here. All right, so now one thing to remember about this is that poverty is not an excuse for low student achievement, because we do have outliers. We have campuses that have a high number of economically disadvantaged students who also have high Domain 1 scores. And we also have campuses who have fewer economically disadvantaged students who are underperforming when compared to their peer groups. And that's what the state's looking at. We want to be an outlier, not following the trend. So the state looks at the scatter plot, they plot every campus, and then they draw a line. Theirs has a bit of a curve to it, like this, and that's kind of supposed to go through the middle there. And then they plot these other lines. They go pretty much like that. And then what they say is, if you were here in the middle, you are a C, and there's a number score associated with that, and you can find all of these in the accountability manual, the lookup tables. If you're performing above this average, in that next group, you're a B, and if you're performing well above that average, then you're going to be an A and earn a certain number of points for that. If you're performing below this though, you're a D, and if you're performing well below that, you're going to be in that F range. So you earn a score for that, which gets scaled up. So let's say that we were here in this area, so perhaps a 61 raw, we're right in here, and that may scale up to something like a 68 scale. And again, with relative performance, the easiest thing to do is go to the accountability manual, find the lookup table, identify your economically disadvantaged percentage for your campus, and it will give you the cut points that you need to hit for domain 1 in order to be an A, B, C, or D. So that way you know what target you're aiming for. Okay, so we've gone through the state accountability domains. So, like I said at the beginning, the state is going to take the best of one of these to make that 70% of your total score. So if you look at this, you can see that there was a 71 scale score in domain 1, there was a 92 scale score in domain 2 part A, and a 68 scale score in domain 2 part B. So the state is going to take this right here, that 92, and then they're going to multiply that by 70%. We'll do those calculations at the end. But something that's useful to point out here is if your student achievement is not as high as you would like it to be yet, make sure that you're focusing on growing students, because your student growth can carry you even if domain 1 or your relative performance score is lower than you would like it to be. All right, so now let's shift into domain 3, which is federal accountability. So with federal accountability, this is where the state is looking at every subgroup of students that is on your campus, and they're looking at them individually. So you have all the standard subgroups that we've had in the past, things like African American, Hispanic, but then we also have our economically disadvantaged, we have our English language learners, we have our SPED students, and we also have former SPED students who are being monitored, and then we have continuously enrolled and non-continuously enrolled. So this is a total of 14 different subgroups that are being monitored. And now these 14 different subgroups are being monitored in 4 different areas. So the first area is academic achievement. So you're looking at each of those 14 subgroups, and you're looking at how did they perform in reading and math at the MEETS grade level standard. So if you remember back here, Texas still uses approaches, meets, and masters. The federal government said, we're not going to be using approaches for this academic achievement indicator. We're only going to be using MEETS. So the government has set MEETS targets for each of your subgroups. So it's important to make sure you're tracking how are each of my subgroups performing at the MEETS grade level standard on these assessments. So you have academic achievement, and then you have academic growth, or for high schools, districts, K-12s, you have graduation rate. Then you have an English language proficiency. Indicator. And then you have a student success or school quality indicator here. So let's just touch on each of these. I already touched on academic achievement. That's where they're looking at the MEETS grade level standard for each subgroup in reading and math only. Then when you move down here, academic growth is this growth score for every individual subgroup. Graduation rate is the graduation rate for each individual subgroup. Your English language proficiency is only for your English language learners. In Texas, that's based on TELPAS. Then you have your student success and school quality down here. So student success, each of your subgroups gets a domain 1 score, which includes approaches, meets, and masters for all of the tests given on your campus. If it's school quality for a high school, it's the CCMR indicators that we mentioned here for each of the subgroups on your campuses. Now, each of these is weighted differently in your final score. So for example, for academic achievement, if you are an elementary, intermediate, or middle school, this is 30% of this domain. So they look at how many of those targets did you hit for all of your subgroups, take that, multiply it by 30%, and that becomes 30% of the domain 3 score. Academic growth, again, elementary, intermediate, middle, that's 50% of that score. So again, however many targets you hit times 50%. English language proficiency is 10%. And then the student achievement or student success score that comes from here is 10%. So if you are a high school K-12 or district, then academic achievement is 50% for this part. Your graduation status, or if you don't have a graduation rate, your academic growth status is 10%. Then you have English language proficiency again, that's also 10%. And then you have your CCMR indicators for each subgroup here that are going to be worth 30%. So they look at each one of these indicators for every single subgroup that I listed earlier. They weight them accordingly, and then you get your raw score from that, which gets scaled up. I recommend going to txschools.org and pulling up the Closing the Gaps domain report, and you can see these in greater detail. So for this last domain 3, let's just say that everything that I have averages out to a 39 raw. And that is going to scale up to a 66 for my scale score in domain 3 for Closing the Gaps. So then to put it all together, here's what we have. 3 domains from the state. They take the best of one of these. Now you're still going to get, for a campus this year, you're still either getting whether you were improvement required in each of these domains or met standard, and that cut point is a 60. So for our example here, this campus met standard because they were at a 71, they met standard because they were at a 92, and they met standard because they were at a 68. If any of these had been below a 60, then they would have been rated as improvement required in that domain. Then they also met standard here with their scale score of 66. So we have our highest score here, which is a 92, and then we have our Closing the Gaps domain score, which is a 66. So the 92 is going to be multiplied by 70%, and then the 66 from the federal accountability is going to be multiplied by 30%, and those are going to be combined to get your score. So when these get calculated out, this is a 64 and 4/10, which just rounds to a 64, and this is a 19 and 8/10, which rounds to a 20. I'm going to add those two together for a final score of 84. So this is met standard for this campus because it's well above a 60. And then the state is going to issue what if letter grades for each campus in January of 2019. So for example, if they were using the same cut points as district letter grades right now, this would be a B, because the 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 89 as a B, and so on. But if those change, then this could end up being a different letter grade. But for now, this is met standard. It's well above the 60 that this campus needs. So that is a quick, brief overview of the state's new accountability system. So the thing to keep in mind is best of these 3 domains, 30% of this domain. I think one of the keys to this accountability system, though, is if you focus on knowing where all of your students are and you focus on helping them make progress throughout the year, then you're more likely to hit these federal targets, and you're likely to be carried by your academic growth score if your student achievement score is not yet quite where you want it to be. So I hope this was helpful to get a quick summary and a quick overview. And of course, you can always dig deeper into the accountability system by checking out that accountability manual and going deeper into the calculations and the methodology behind each of these domains.